Widow saved a bleeding outlaw. Then he whispered, "You saved me once." The knock came just after midnight. It was soft at first, so soft she thought it might be the wind pushing against the wooden door. But then it came again, slower this time, weaker. A sound that didn't belong to the night. Sarah Bennett sat up in bed, her heart already tight in her chest. No one came to her door anymore. Not since her husband died. Not since the town began to forget her name. She pulled a shawl over her nightgown and moved through the dark cabin with careful steps. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the smell of dust and something else. Something wet and iron-thick. Blood. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the latch. In a place like this, you didn't open your door in the dark. You didn't trust a knock you couldn't explain. The frontier had taught her that. The West had no mercy for the careless. But the knock came again, and this time it was followed by a voice. "Please." Just one word. Barely more than a breath. Sarah unlatched the door and pulled it open. A man lay crumpled on her porch, half in shadow, half in the pale glow of the moon. His shirt was soaked dark with blood, his face pressed against the dirt like he'd been crawling. His hat had fallen a few feet away, dusty and bent. One hand was pressed against his side, trembling. The other reached toward her, fingers curled like he was trying to hold onto something that wasn't there. For a moment, she didn't move. She only stared. He was an outlaw. She could see it in the way he carried himself, even now, even broken. There was a gun belt around his waist, the leather worn and cracked from years of use. A revolver hung loose in its holster, covered in dirt. His boots were scuffed and road-worn, the kind a man wore when he'd been running for a long time. She should have shut the door. She should have turned away. But she didn't. "Help me," he whispered again, and his voice cracked like dry wood splitting under weight. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands already reaching before her mind could catch up. She touched his shoulder gently, and he flinched. His eyes opened, just barely, and for a second they locked onto hers. They were dark and desperate, full of something she couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or regret. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, though she didn't know why she said it. Maybe because he looked like he needed to hear it. Maybe because she needed to believe it herself. He nodded once, then his head fell back against the porch. Sarah slipped her arms under his shoulders and pulled. He was heavier than she expected, but she'd lifted hay bales and water buckets and her husband's body when he'd collapsed in the barn 3 years ago. She knew how to carry weight. She dragged him inside, inch by inch, until he was lying on the floor near the fireplace. His breathing was shallow and uneven, his chest rising and falling like a man drowning on dry land. She shut the door behind her and locked it. Then she lit a candle. The light flickered across his face, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. He was younger than she thought, maybe 30, maybe less. His face was rough and sunburned, his jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble. There was a scar running down the side of his neck, old and pale, like something that had healed a long time ago. His hair was dark and matted with sweat and dust. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Even half-closed, even clouded with pain, there was something familiar in them. Something she couldn't place. Sarah knelt beside him and pressed her hand against the wound in his side. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and sticky. She'd seen wounds like this before. Gunshot. Close range. He was lucky to still be breathing. "Stay with me," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She moved quickly. She grabbed a basin of water from the table, a clean cloth, and a bottle of whiskey she kept in the cupboard. Her hands shook as she poured the whiskey over the wound, and the man's body jerked violently. A low groan tore from his throat, but he didn't wake. She worked in silence, cleaning the blood away, pressing the cloth tight against his side to slow the bleeding. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the sound of his breath. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the distance, sharp and lonesome. Sarah didn't know why she was doing this. She didn't know him. He was a stranger, worse than a stranger. He was dangerous. A man like this didn't end up bleeding on someone's porch unless he'd done something wrong. Unless someone wanted him dead. But still she stayed. She wrapped his wound with a strip of cloth torn from an old sheet, tying it tight. His breathing steadied just a little. His face relaxed. And as she sat back on her heels, watching him in the candlelight, something stirred in the back of her mind. A memory she couldn't quite reach. The scar on his neck. The way his hand had curled when he reached for her. The shape of his face in the firelight. She leaned closer, her eyes tracing the lines of his features. And then she saw it, the faint curve of his brow, the way his jaw set even in sleep. She'd seen that face before. Not like this. Not broken and bleeding. But somewhere. Sometime. Her breath caught. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man's eyes fluttered open. Just barely. He looked at her, and for a moment, the pain seemed to fade from his face. He stared at her like he was seeing something sacred. Something he'd been searching for. And then, in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it, he spoke. "Sarah." Her name. He said her name. Her heart stopped. Her hands froze. She stared at him, her mind racing, her chest tight with something that felt like fear and recognition all tangled together. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice trembling. But he didn't answer. His eyes closed again, and his head fell to the side. And Sarah sat there in the candlelight, alone with a bleeding stranger who somehow knew who she was. 3 days passed before he could sit up without wincing. Sarah kept her distance, mostly. She brought him water in a tin cup and broth made from the last of her dried beef. She changed his bandages when the blood soaked through, her hands steady and her face empty of expression. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer answers. And the silence between them grew thick, like dust settling after a storm. But she watched him. She couldn't help it. He slept most of the first 2 days, his body fighting the fever that came with the wound. When he was awake, he sat propped against the wall near the fireplace, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and careful. He never reached for his gun, never asked where it was. He just sat there, quiet as stone, like a man who'd already made peace with whatever was coming. And every time she moved through the room, his eyes followed her. Not in the way men usually looked at women. Not with hunger or want. It was something else. Something softer. Like he was trying to memorize her face. Like he was afraid she might disappear if he looked away. It unsettled her. On the third evening, Sarah was sweeping the floor when she noticed him staring at the mantel above the fireplace. His gaze was fixed on the small wooden frame that sat there, dusty and faded. It held the only photograph she owned, her wedding day. She was 19 in that picture, standing beside her husband in front of the church. Her dress was simple, her smile shy. Her husband's hand rested on her shoulder, proud and steady. She hadn't looked at that photograph in months, maybe longer. The outlaw reached out slowly, his hand trembling just a little, and touched the edge of the frame. His fingers were careful, like he was afraid to break it. "I was there," he said quietly. Sarah stopped sweeping, the broom stilled in her hands. "What?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the photograph, his jaw tight, his throat working like he was swallowing something hard. "Your wedding day," he said. "I was there." Sarah's heart stumbled. She set the broom against the wall and stepped closer, her pulse loud in her ears. "That was 15 years ago," she said slowly. I don't remember you." "I know." His voice was rough, worn down like leather left too long in the sun. "You wouldn't." He finally looked at her, and the weight in his eyes was almost too much to hold. There was pain there, yes, but also something deeper. Something that looked like longing. Like loss. "I was just a boy," he said. "Worked on your father's ranch for a season. Spring and summer, maybe. I mucked stalls. Fixed fences. Slept in the barn with the other hands." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the photograph. "You didn't know my name. I don't think you ever looked at me twice." Sarah's breath caught. Her father's ranch. The old place outside of town, before he sold it and moved closer to the church. She'd been so young then, so full of dreams and hope and the kind of innocence that doesn't last long in the West. She tried to remember, tried to picture the ranch hands who'd come and gone that summer. There had been so many. Drifters mostly. Cowboys looking for work, outlaws trying to go straight, boys running from something they wouldn't name. But she couldn't place him. "I don't remember," she said softly, and the words felt like an apology. "I know," he said again. "You were kind, though. You always were. You brought water out to the fields when it was hot. You smiled at us when your father wasn't looking. You treated us like we were people, not just hands." He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. Sarah stepped forward instinctively, but he waved her off. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice said otherwise. She stayed where she was, standing in the middle of the small cabin, her arms crossed over her chest. She felt exposed suddenly, like he could see through her, like he knew things about her she'd forgotten herself. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. Then quietly, "Caleb. Caleb Warren." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, like it was something heavy he'd been carrying for too long, made her chest ache. "Why did you come here, Caleb?" she asked. "Why my door?" He looked down at his hands. They were rough and scarred, the hands of a man who'd lived hard and paid for it. He turned them over slowly, like he was searching for an answer written in the lines of his palms. "Because I owed you," he said finally. "Owed me?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't understand." "You won't remember this either," he said, his voice low and steady. "But one night, back on your father's ranch, I got caught stealing food from the kitchen. I was hungry, hadn't eaten in 2 days. Your father would have thrown me off the property, or worse. But you," he paused, his jaw tightening. "You told him it was a mistake, said you'd given me permission. You lied for me." Sarah's breath stilled. A memory flickered in the back of her mind, faint and dusty, like something half forgotten. A boy in the kitchen. Her father's voice, sharp and angry. And her own voice, small but firm, saying it was her fault. "I remember," she whispered. Caleb's eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, something passed between them. Something quiet and fragile. "You saved me that night," he said. "I never forgot it." Sarah didn't know what to say. She felt the weight of his words settle over her like a blanket, warm and heavy. She'd forgotten that boy, forgotten that moment. But he hadn't. He'd carried it with him all these years, through whatever dark roads had turned him into the man sitting in her cabin now. "I didn't know what else to do," she said softly. "You look so scared." "I was," he admitted. "I was always scared back then. Scared of being hungry. Scared of being nothing. Scared of disappearing." He looked at her again, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But you saw me, even when no one else did." The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Sarah felt something shift inside her, something she couldn't name. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, and it wasn't trust. But it was close. She sat down in the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "What happened to you, Caleb?" she asked gently. "How did you end up like this?" He smiled, but it was a sad, broken thing. "That," he said, "is a long story." And for the first time since he'd knocked on her door, Sarah thought maybe she wanted to hear it. Caleb told her the story slowly, like a man pulling splinters from an old wound. He started with the ranch, her father's land, the summer heat, the dust that settled on everything like a second skin. He told her about the barn where he slept, the smell of hay and horse sweat, the way the other cowboys ignored him because he was young and small and didn't belong. He told her about the nights he went hungry because the foreman forgot to feed him, or because there wasn't enough, or because he was too proud to ask. And then he told her about the morning she found him. "I was behind the barn," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire, sitting in the dirt, trying not to cry. "I was 16, maybe younger. I don't remember any more. But I was so hungry I couldn't think straight. My stomach hurt. My hands shook. I thought maybe I'd just lie down and let the desert take me." Sarah listened without speaking, her hands folded in her lap, her heart heavy. You came around the corner, Caleb continued, carrying a basket. You were heading to the chicken coop, I think. But you stopped when you saw me. And you looked at me, really looked at me, like I mattered. He paused, his throat working. You asked if I was all right. I lied and said yes. But you didn't believe me. You went back inside and came out a few minutes later with bread wrapped in cloth and a blanket. You handed them to me and said, "Don't let my father see this." Then you smiled. His voice cracked just a little. Just once. A small smile. But it was everything. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She remembered that morning now, not clearly, but enough. A boy in the dirt. Her father's anger, if he found out she'd been soft. The way her mother had taught her to help people quietly, without making a show of it. I didn't think about it, she said softly. I couldn't leave you there. I know, Caleb said. That's what made it real. You didn't do it for credit. You didn't do it because someone was watching. You did it because it was the right thing to do. He looked at her then, his eyes dark and full of something that looked like gratitude and grief tangled together. That bread and that blanket kept me alive for another week. And that smile. I held on to that smile for 15 years. Sarah felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. What happened after you left the ranch? She asked. Caleb leaned his head back against the wall, his jaw tight. I drifted, he said. Worked where I could. Slept where I could. Got into trouble more times than I can count. Met a man in New Mexico who taught me how to shoot. Got good at it. Too good. Started riding with a gang. Robbed stagecoaches. Banks. Trains. Told myself it was survival. Told myself I didn't have a choice. He closed his eyes. But the truth is, I was angry. Angry at the world. Angry at God. Angry at every rancher and sheriff and shopkeeper who'd ever looked at me like I was dirt. So I became what they thought I was. An outlaw. A thief. A man with a price on his head and nowhere left to run. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. How much? $500, Caleb said. Dead or alive? The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. $500. That was more than most men made in a year. It was enough to rebuild a barn, buy a horse, start over somewhere new. Her neighbors would call her a fool for keeping him here. The law would call her worse. They're looking for you, she said. I know. They'll come here eventually. I know. She looked at him. This broken man who'd once been a hungry boy. This outlaw who'd carried her kindness like a torch through the darkest parts of his life. And she felt something shift inside her. Something she couldn't name. Why did you come back? She asked. After all this time. Why here? Why now? Caleb opened his eyes and looked at her with a sadness, so deep it seemed to pull the light out of the room. Because I'm dying, he said simply. Sarah's breath caught. The wound, she asked. He shook his head. The wound will heal. Or it won't. Doesn't matter. I've been dying for a long time, Sarah. Not my body. Something deeper. I'm tired. I'm so tired. And I knew if I was going to die, I wanted to see you one last time. Wanted to say thank you. Wanted you to know that you mattered. That what you did for me mattered. His voice broke on the last word, and Sarah felt her heart crack open. She stood slowly and crossed the room. She knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't pull away. He just sat there, staring at the fire, his face carved with regret and exhaustion. You should turn me in, he said quietly. Take the money. God knows you need it more than anyone. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the empty cupboards in her kitchen, the roof that leaked when it rained, the way the townspeople whispered about her when she walked past, the widow who had nothing and no one. She thought about what $500 could do, what it could buy, what it could change. But she also thought about the boy in the dirt, the bread and the blanket, the smile she'd given without thinking. And she thought about mercy, not the kind of mercy that comes easy, not the kind that's earned or deserved, but the kind that costs something, The kind that asks you to see the human underneath the sin. The kind that says, you are broken, but you are not beyond reach. I'm not turning you in, she said. Caleb's head turned sharply, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah, I'm not, she said again, her voice firm. I don't care what they say. I don't care what they think. You came here because you needed help. And I'm going to help you. You don't owe me anything, he said, his voice rough. I know, she said. But maybe that's the point. He stared at her, his face full of something that looked like hope and fear all at once. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled long and lonesome. Sarah stood and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the desert stretched out under the moonlight. Empty and endless. Beautiful and cruel. They'll come, she said softly. The sheriff. The bounty hunters. They'll come, and when they do, I'll have to make a choice. Caleb didn't answer. He just watched her, his heart in his eyes. And Sarah wondered if mercy was always this hard. If choosing to see the good in someone always meant risking everything. But she already knew the answer. Because mercy wasn't about safety. It was about love. And love, in a world like this, was the bravest thing a person could do. She let the curtain fall and turned back to him, her voice steady and sure. Rest, she said, while you still can. And in the quiet that followed, both of them knew the storm was coming. They came with the sunrise. Sarah heard the horses before she saw them. The slow, steady rhythm of hooves on hard earth, the creak of leather saddles, the jingle of spurs. She stood at the window, her hand resting against the glass, and watched as 4 riders crested the hill. The sheriff rode in front, his badge catching the early light. Behind him, 3 men she didn't recognize. Bounty hunters, probably. Men with hard faces and empty eyes. The kind who tracked outlaws for money and didn't ask questions about right or wrong. Behind her, Caleb sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she'd made him. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He'd known this moment was coming. It's time, she said quietly. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like a man accepting his fate. He set the cup down carefully, his hands steady despite everything. Then he stood, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound. He'd healed enough to walk. Enough to ride, if they let him. Enough to hang, if they didn't. Sarah turned to face him, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. 2 people who'd been strangers a week ago. 2 people who'd carried their own kind of brokenness through the world. And somehow, in this small cabin on the edge of nowhere, they'd found something neither of them expected. Understanding. Thank you, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. For everything. Sarah didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded. Then she opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of sage and dust. The sky was pale and endless, the kind of sky that made you feel small. The sheriff reined his horse to a stop a few feet from the porch, his eyes hard and watchful. The bounty hunters spread out behind him, their hands resting on their guns ready. The sheriff was an older man, weathered and lean, with gray in his beard and lines carved deep around his eyes. Sarah had seen him in town a few times over the years. He'd tipped his hat to her once at the general store. Another time, he'd helped her carry a sack of flour to her wagon. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a man who followed the law, and the law didn't bend for anyone. Mrs. Bennett, he said, his voice calm but firm. We're looking for a man. Caleb Horn, wanted for robbery and murder. We have reason to believe he's here. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face still, kept her voice steady. He's here, she said. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly, surprise flickering across his face. He'd expected her to lie, to protect the outlaw, to make this harder than it needed to be. Is he armed? The sheriff asked. No, Sarah said. His gun is inside. He won't fight you. One of the bounty hunters shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his holster. Then bring him out, he said, his voice cold and impatient. Sarah's gaze moved to the bounty hunter, then back to the sheriff. She took a breath, slow and deep, gathering all the courage she had left. "I'm asking you not to kill him," she said. The words hung in the air like a prayer. The sheriff stared at her for a long moment. His jaw tightened. His eyes searched her face, looking for something. Weakness, maybe, or foolishness. But whatever he saw made him pause. "He's a criminal, Mrs. Bennett," the sheriff said quietly. "He's robbed stagecoaches, killed men. There's a price on his head for a reason." "I know," Sarah said. "But he's also a man. A broken man. And he came here because he had nowhere else to go. That doesn't change what he's done." "No," Sarah agreed. "It doesn't. But it matters how you bring him in. It matters whether you choose to see him as a person or just a bounty." The sheriff's face was unreadable. Behind him, the bounty hunters exchanged glances, their expressions hard and skeptical. One of them spat into the dust. "We didn't ride all this way to listen to a widow preach," the man said. The sheriff held up a hand, silencing him. He kept his eyes on Sarah. "Why are you protecting him?" he asked. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Because someone protected me once," she said. "When my husband died, this town forgot I existed. But there were a few people who didn't. People who brought me food when I had none. People who fixed my fence when it broke. People who saw me when I felt invisible." Her voice softened, but it didn't break. "Mercy isn't something you earn, Sheriff. It's something you give, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The sheriff was quiet. His horse shifted beneath him, snorting softly. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dust at their feet. And then, slowly, the sheriff nodded. "Bring him out," he said. "Hands where we can see them. No sudden moves." Sarah turned and walked back inside. Caleb was standing by the door, his face pale but calm. She met his eyes and saw everything he couldn't say. Gratitude, regret, fear, hope. "It's time," she said again. He nodded. Then he stepped past her and walked out onto the porch. The sunlight hit him full in the face, and for a moment, he looked like any other man. Tired, worn, human. He raised his hands slowly, his palms open, his movements careful and deliberate. The bounty hunters tensed, their hands on their guns, but the sheriff raised his hand again, stopping them. "Easy," the sheriff said. Caleb walked down the steps, his boots crunching in the dirt. He stopped a few feet from the sheriff's horse and lowered his hands just enough to show he wasn't a threat. The sheriff dismounted and pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. He approached Caleb slowly, his eyes never leaving the outlaw's face. "You're under arrest, Caleb Horn," the sheriff said, "for robbery and murder. You'll stand trial in Silver Creek." Caleb didn't resist. He let the sheriff clasp the cuffs around his wrists, the metal cold and heavy. Then he turned, just for a moment, and looked back at Sarah. She stood on the porch, her hands folded in front of her, her face calm, but her eyes full of emotion. "You saved me once when I was nothing," Caleb said, his voice breaking just a little. "You saved me again when I deserved nothing. I won't forget." Sarah's throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, slow and sure. "Neither will I," she said softly. The sheriff led Caleb to one of the horses and helped him out. The bounty hunters circled around him, their faces hard and satisfied. And then, without another word, they turned and rode away, back toward the horizon, back toward whatever justice waited for a man like Caleb Horn. Sarah stood on the porch and watched them go. She watched until they were nothing but shadows against the morning sky, until the dust settled and the world was quiet again. And then, for the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Peace. Not because she'd fixed him, not because she'd saved him from his past, but because she'd chosen love over fear. She'd chosen to see the broken boy underneath the outlaw. She'd chosen mercy when the world would have chosen vengeance. And in a hard world, full of dust and silence and regret, that choice mattered. It mattered more than she'd ever know. She turned and walked back inside, closing the door softly behind her. The cabin was quiet, empty, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like grace.